AWANI Global with me, Naila Huda. And this week, not only did we see leaders from across the region gather for the 46th ASEAN Summit, but we also witnessed greater cross-regional diplomacy with the ASEAN-GCC Summit, bringing Southeast Asia and the Gulf closer than ever. So on AWANI Global tonight, we want to unpack the outcomes, opportunities and potential challenges perhaps of the ASEAN-GCC Summit and this partnership. And we're joined by two insightful experts to help us make sense of this evolving partnership. First up, we have Dr. Zokri Idris, International Relations Analyst, and we also have joining us Dr. Ruina Abdul Razak, Historical Consultant. Dr. Zokri is a scholar and practitioner in international relations with a focus on diplomacy and the sovereignty of developing nations. Dr. Ruina holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she studied modern Iranian history, and she has also lectured on the politics of the Persian Arabian Gulf at the London School of Economics. Thank you so much, Zokri and Ruina, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Perhaps I'll start with Zokri. Looking at the ASEAN-GCC Summit and looking at some of the media coverage and some of the analysts discussing this, marking this as perhaps a little bit more significant, because I guess we're also seeing this in a contextual light, seeing growing power rivalry and also a lot of uncertainty around the world. What do you make of this, and why do you think it's a lot more significant this time around?
We have seen ASEAN-GCC summit before. The first summit took place a couple of years back. We also always have seen ASEAN and China summit, but we have not seen in our history the ASEAN, the GCC countries, and China set together in a summit agreeing to certain things. If we read into the joint statement produced by all of these leaders, now you will see wonders in a sense that normal joint statements were only produced for a couple of pages, up to 3 pages maximum. But this time around, you have 9 pages in total, explaining and detailing what areas of cooperation, opportunities that these countries are looking for. So I think the focus is not really about all of these rivalry and the global uncertainty. I mean, that's given the scenario these days. But what is interesting to me as an analyst is that these 3 blocks, or these 2 blocks and one super gigantic economy, China, set together in a summit hosted in Kuala Lumpur. And I think that's quite a tremendous achievement that these 3 parties are actually achieving. So that would be the take for now. It is unprecedented that China, GCC, and ASEAN sit together. And I think there are more to unpack when we look into all of this at 9-page of the joint statement between the leaders.
We'll look at ASEAN-GCC China a bit shortly, but if we were to just look at ASEAN-GCC, Rowena, what do you think are some of your key takeaways from the summit?
Thank you. I agree with Dr. Zokri that it's definitely significant that all 3 major parties sat together. I think, though, there are some key issues that I find with this particular summit is that it was the focus was the economy, with Donald Trump's tariffs and the uncertainty, produced by Donald Trump's back and forth policies on the economy. So all of this, I think, has really shaken the world economic situation. So I think that was definitely the focus of it. But there were some things that were definitely missing within the summit, sort of addressing the key issues that we have here. The GCC has very strong relations with the US politically. And some of the GCC states are moving towards normalization of relations with countries like Israel, for example. And I think this is a bit of almost a schizophrenic approach, really, because you have the economy on one side and such a sort of everyone's on the same page there. But when it comes to real issues in sort of the Middle Eastern region, for example, you have a lot of, there's still a lot of things that don't really mesh within the ASEAN countries and with the GCC countries and their respective foreign policies. So, and also with the case of Iran, who is a missing member of the GCC and is a significant significant country of the Persian and Arabian Gulf. So it's significant from an economic point of view, but I think it definitely lacks when we think about politics and real rivalries, that really do exist.
Economic priorities were definitely on top of the agenda. Yeah, Zokri, go ahead.
But I think Marina raised a really interesting point. And normally in a summit, we focus on cooperations and collaborations. But this year's ASEAN GCC and China summit, the humanitarian issue is clearly spelled out, especially in page 2. And normally the humanitarian issues in the Middle East, it's not really a big interest of the entire ASEAN countries. It might be an interest for Malaysia, Indonesia, because these are Muslim countries or Muslim-dominated countries. But to get all of the ASEAN countries to condemn the humanitarian issues in Gaza and the Middle East is something unprecedented. Well, that's the first development. Now, the second development, we are also seeing a little bit of the changing behavior of China to agree on condemning these humanitarian issues because China has always been pro-economy, pro-development, less issues. But having this summit together, it shows that there is actually a starting moment for China to be seen as a neutralizer for humanitarian issues, particularly in the Middle East. And I think that's really interesting to see in the months or the years to come. So those are the two things to build up what Dr. Rowena has said earlier on.
Apart from economic priorities and some concerns of humanitarian issues, we want to look specifically at what Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim said, describing this summit, the ASEAN-GCC, as well as the ASEAN-GCC China Summit, as, quote, a new chapter of dialogue and cooperation. Zokri, what do you see some of the key strategic opportunities that this new kind of alliance, this partnership could unlock for ASEAN?
Well, there are five main aspects or pillars being spelled out in the joint statement from the economic cooperations, connectivity, energy, food security, and people-to-people exchange. Now, while we read those sentences are quite general and it's quite positive reaffirmation, but it shows there is actually an interest to spark a discussion and to spark a collaboration that all of the countries in ASEAN, as well as the Gulf Cooperation countries and China willing to go deeper into all of these five aspects. Maybe what we have to look further is the implementational aspects of these five pillars. I mean, everyone just can say and pronounce and announce, but what we are lacking is actually the actual implementation, monitoring and evaluation on all of these five pillars that they have agreed. But I think it's a good start. And I think that's what Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim meant when it says that it is actually a platform to unlock the potential in ASEAN.
Rowena, earlier you talked a little bit about some of the humanitarian concerns and about, power rivalry and I guess some of the gaps that we're seeing in the ASEAN-GCC Summit. But just talking about alliances in general, do you see this cooperation as perhaps signaling a shift towards changing global alliances, perhaps part of a broader move or shift away from perhaps a reliance on Western partners as it used to be traditionally? And what are perhaps some of the geopolitical motivations or pressures that lead to this?
Yes, I think that there could be a sort of performative move away from the West, but whether this is truly truly real in the real sense, I'm not so sure, because as I mentioned earlier, the GCC countries, ASEAN countries, still have very significant ties to the West and the US in particular, and the EU. ASEAN and the EU have very good relations, for example, besides this. So when we talk about the West, I think, obviously we mean the US very specifically. It is important to have this collective, this one block stance against the US, especially when it comes to US economic policies. It helps provide some inoculation against the instabilities that US economic policy provides at the moment, the back and forth policies, the tariffs, so on and so forth, and the pulling back of key things such as US aid, US financing of humanitarian issues, and so on. So I think this is important and helps sort of mitigate what the US is doing currently. However, politically, in terms of alignment, there is still a lot of alignment with post-Cold War Western attitudes. However, and as I said, each of the member states, Saudi Arabia, for example, has very strong relations with the United States. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The only thing I think of some interesting significance is things like the Iran deal. The United States is currently on the road to actually finalizing Iran nuclear deal, and I think this is going to change things a little bit because it might bring down the temperature between the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. I'm very interested to see where that leads in the end. And so we might see Iran sort of playing a bigger role maybe in the future. And that might sort of temper Saudi-Iranian rivalry, which has really colored the Middle Eastern region quite a bit. So I think it's interesting. And Russia is another key player that we haven't really noted. Each of ASEAN and GCC's countries all have good relations with Russia. So for a long time, ASEAN has kind of been not terribly affected by these global rivalries between the US and Russia. The Ukraine one didn't really affect ASEAN per se. We never really took a very strong side against Ukraine, against Russia and for Ukraine. So in terms of, we've been very, as a region, very deft and very clever at mitigating that global rivalry anyway. So I think this just creates a bigger block and a bigger sort of platform for regional cooperation and so on. But it doesn't really change the status quo. We've always been very good as a region, ASEAN as a region, in mitigating those global rivalries anyway. So,
Zokri, on that note, on the tariff pressures specifically, a lot of analysts were talking about or calling for market diversification, especially in the region. Do you see this as being a healthy step towards diversification, this sort of alliance or allying with other middle powers or other blocs?
I think this is what exactly how we, Malaysia, in this particular stance, is responding. We want to diversify our market. And we are actually identifying new markets in the GCC, as well as strengthening our markets hold in China. And this is nothing new, not even during the tariff introduction. I think it has been ongoing for forever, how that Malaysia as a developing, as a trading nation, look towards diversification of its market. The only challenge that we have is that what we could offer is something relatively small, and we don't have the bandwidth to actually provide the market. For instance, we are seriously lacking in human resources of semiconductor, E&E sectors, which is currently in high demand, but because of lacking of human resources, we could not actually tap into that. So I think in short, we realize that we have to diversify, and it has ongoing projected by MITI, our Ministry of International Trade and Industry, but somehow there is actually a gap on our readiness and capabilities towards diversification. But ASEAN, GCC, and China is another way on how that we can elevate. It is kind of like three kind of factors moving together like a triangle, then I think what we can see in the next few years that perhaps Malaysians export will definitely have an impact to us. Well, it's something yet to be seen, but I think it's something along the way we are on the right track.
Rowena, you mentioned a little bit about how ASEAN is always good at managing power rivalries. If we were to go back to that idea of strengthening alliances with other middle powers, other blocs. Some analysts were also talking about potentially creating a non-aligned or a third way strategy working with other middle powers in global politics. Performative or not, symbolic or not, do you see this realistically happening, and what would it practically look like?
It's already kind of happening, especially at an individual level. What I think is one of the key things about ASEAN and one of its powers is really that each individual country has been able to pursue its own policies, in its own foreign policies, and then that creates stability for ASEAN as a platform and as a cross-regional body on a whole. And I think this allows for if we do sort of move towards middle power, sort of like engaging with middle powers, countries like Iran, for example, this is already happening. And I think this will help because each individual country has good relations with countries like Iran, with key countries in key African states, for example. This will help provide any kind of platform and any kind of framework that will help for any third party sort of if ASEAN wants to, as a collective, approach these countries individually, because that's already happening at an individual level. Malaysia, for example, has quite good relations with Iran politically, economically, despite maybe some differences in terms of religion, but they have been able to mitigate US sanctions, Iran's sort of bad reputation, sort of quote unquote bad reputation internationally. And because of that, we have some sort of stability. And I think that provides stability to ASEAN as a whole.
I want to go back to that point on trade and economic collaborations or economic cooperation specifically. Zokri, you mentioned with this alliance or this partnership potentially unlocking even more economic opportunities with sectors such as energy, digital economy and whatnot. We're looking at trade between ASEAN and GCC countries valued at over $130 billion, with a lot of analysts also pointing towards deeper economic integration, or at least that's a lot of the buzzwords that's being mentioned in a lot of the documents, a lot of the meetings, to deepen economic integration across the board with both regions. How would this realistically look like? I mean, one reference that we have is, of course, the European Union, right, with having really deep financial integration across all these member countries. Do we even have that within ASEAN, and how would this look like between two now regional blocs?
Oh, well, I think we have to stick with the reality, regardless of how ASEAN achieved the numbers and the growth momentum. The ASEAN is a region that consists of 10 different countries, and these 10 different countries has different economic challenges and economic disparity. We are talking about how the high-level income economies like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, as well as those who are actually achieving lower than the actual income, like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. So I think we have to be fair. What ASEAN achieved does not actually reflect into the growth of the entire region that also consists of these economic disparity countries. But what we can do is that there is actually moving towards that. The challenge that I see in this situation is how that ASEAN could minimize and narrow the gap between these two blocks in ASEAN countries as well, so that the number of the total of growth enjoyed by ASEAN with the GCC or with China for that matter also been shared and also been distributed with all of the countries, including Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. And I think one thing that is interesting in the joint statement, we see in the aspect of connectivity, China managed to put BRI into that statement. We all know that BRI has been contentious, not only in Southeast Asian countries, but in the South Asian countries. But the achievement of putting and acknowledging BRI as one of the channels for us to connect and integrate with one another, what I can see in the future is how that ASEAN countries, to a certain extent, the GCC countries, leveraging on the BRI, Belt and Road initiatives, to make sure that peoples are integrated, peoples are close with one another, and businesses are very much intertwined with one another. So I have good feelings that the joint statement or this time summit is a little bit more focused. We know what we want to do and we know what our aims. What is left is how to put it into that tangible and intangible results, as well as the implementational strategy to make these things happen.
I guess one step closer to making it into reality would be one of the ideas that's being proposed is the free trade agreement that's already being discussed between ASEAN and the GCC. Zokri, what do you think an ideal free trade agreement would look like for both sides?
An ideal free trade agreement on both sides is to look into the existing economic parameters enjoyed by these two countries, as well as looking at one of the hotspots that is not being tapped by these two countries. We talk about medical tourism. Now, Malaysia Indonesia and Thailand, but Malaysia in particular has been voted as the #1 medical tourism destinations in the world. And this is something that we have to project to the GCC countries instead of the conventional trades, goods and services. I think we are actually emerging into new aspects of trade. Another aspect, I think last year we had this Halal Expo in Dubai, where Malaysia participated quite aggressively and very target oriented in the Halal Expo. Now, again, the Halal market is very huge, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in the GCC countries. So with all of these new innovations and new ideas, I do hope that the FTA will able to make us shift a little bit from the normal conventional trade, which definitely depending on the regional supply chain, global supply chain by the geopolitics and the geoeconomics, but to look into the areas that is less risky and able to have a more stable attractive factors to these two regions, GCC as well as ASEAN.
I want to take a break for a little bit from the ASEAN-GCC and just quickly touch on the ASEAN-GCC China Summit. We've also seen some reports of the China's Premier Li Qiang urging the three regions to serve as a beacon of cross-civilizational integration, and he also mentioned the need to collectively champion shared Asian values. Rowena, what do you make of this? Do you think this is just rhetoric? How do you think this would play into diplomacy and public perception?
It's very smart. It's a really good way for China to kind of assert itself in some way as well, to sort of so that it is playing a big role, but it also a big role regionally, but it also shows that China is willing to work with others. And I think this is quite key. There's always been this rhetoric, especially with the West, that China is a kind of big major power, wants to do things on its own. But here we're seeing China working together, granted by the fact that it is probably also pushing for its own agenda, such as the BRI that Dr. Zokri mentioned earlier. And there has always been this case that China wants to move forward in the region as well. You know, we've had cases between China and the Philippines, for example, especially when it comes to territories and so on, and dominance of the South China Seas and South China Sea as well. So it definitely wants to push itself forward as a kind of leader of ASEAN and Asian leadership. But even then, what does that actually really mean in reality? What does that would look like? Yes, at the end of the day, ASEAN is strong because of its diversity and differences. To have some sort of collective mindset, collective identity, I think takes away from the diversity that ASEAN brings. Because it has different relationships, it has different histories, it has different foreign policies, but collectively it comes together to sort of to protect the region economically as well as to some extent politically, and provide that kind of stability that's very important. But it's nice that China wants to sort of push for this kind of agenda, but at the same time, I think one should be quite cautious as to where it sees itself and whether it sees itself in a kind of leadership role. Pushing agenda is one thing, but what does that exactly mean? I think we'll have to sort of see where things go from now on. It's all nice words, but what does it actually mean? And I think it's very important that ASEAN still maintains its individuality, if that makes sense. And its individual members' individuality and foreign policy sort of profile, as it were.
We're coming towards the end of the discussion now, but Zokri, you pointed out a lot of strengths, a lot of opportunities that this kind of partnership unlocks for ASEAN and the GCC as well. But what do you think are some potential obstacles or tensions that could present itself as a challenge to this partnership?
Well, I think the first challenge is in how that we are going to standardize perhaps a regulatory framework on how this summit can move further. Now, if we look again into the joint statement, there are various agreements, summits been listed down for these countries to actually adopt to. So again, it's nice that all of this have been put into a joint statement. That means it is recognized, it is validated, it is signed by all of the leaders. But what we can see in the future is how do we actually harmonize and standardize different framework, different blueprints and roadmap together. But having it into this statement is already a positive sign because everyone signed upon it. And I think the challenge will also go into the implementation. Again, I spoke about implementations earlier on. Summit after summit is always about producing joint statements, but I think the implementation and auditing has not been released. So perhaps there will be a third party or any independent contractual auditing organizations that will do an audit as well as evaluation. Where are we after a summit into another? So implementation remains a challenge to this ASEAN-GCC and China summit.
A lot of interesting points there that we'd like to talk about, but that's all the time that we have, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Sokri and Rowena, for sharing your thoughts with us on the ASEAN-GCC Summit. Definitely a lot to look out for what's to come, not just with the two regional blocs, but as well with China now as part of the game. Thank you so much to Sokri and Rowena. Once again, that's all for AWANI Global tonight. With me, Nala Huda. We'll see you again.